Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another, this time, a special edition of our conversations on Brazilian politics and geopolitics as far as our event today. Today, we are joined by retired Major General Michael Repass, who commanded U.S. Special Operations Command Europe until 2013. He is a board member at the Global Special Operation Forces Foundation and is the CEO and founder of Able Global Solutions, a company that, among other things, examines strategic trends in the international environment to provide clients actionable perspectives. Major General Repass has been directly involved with Ukraine security issues since 2016, so it is our immense pleasure to have him with us today. Good morning, General.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me here, and I appreciate the time with your audience today.
It's our pleasure.
General Repass, thank you so much for your participation today. And we are unfortunately not discussing only what the state of the world is or strategies or general outcomes, but we have a very, very complicated situation in the world today. We have the risk of a very nasty conflict in Ukraine expanding beyond its borders. And for us to begin, I would like to understand a little bit, how do you see the beginning of all this situation? What brought us to the current situation of Putin becoming so aggressive in relation to Ukraine? And how can we pinpoint, or what can we pinpoint as the major ultimate goal of Putin in relation to Ukraine?
Okay, thank you for that question. And I think it's rather broad, so we'll start broad and then bring us up to where we are today. So why the conflict? How did this thing begin? It really started with Vladimir Putin. He's the progenitor of it. He's the architect of it, and he'll be the recipient of all that is good and bad coming out of this. So Putin is the both subject and direct object of everything that happens in regarding this conflict in Ukraine. So he started out some years ago, basically trying to correct what he thought was the most significant cultural disaster to ever happen to the Soviet Union or Russia, which was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He's had this burning grudge, this burning desire to correct what he saw was a tremendous disservice to his nation. That has turned into a perverse, I would say, vision of how to roll back progress on the liberal democratic front that has happened in Europe as a matter of national political discourse. And so he's sought to draw a red line with the advance of NATO, as he sees it, into traditional spaces where previously the Soviet Union and now Russia has preeminence, in particular Ukraine, and also in Georgia, the Central Asian states, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and then, South Caucasus, and then the Central Asian states. He does not view the Baltic states as legitimate countries. They are, in fact, provinces of Russia in his view. So these are his, I would say, his not his worldview, but his regional view. And he is exceedingly offended and believes it to be a matter of an existential threat that NATO actually borders Russia in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. He's not going to tolerate a cession into NATO by Ukraine. He thinks that is a strategic risk that he and Russia cannot accept. So he has created this mythology around it. And the mythology is such that Russia and Ukraine are actually brothers that are separated by artificial political borders. And so therefore those borders don't really exist culturally, historically, or in any practical means other than just some political construct that no longer has any validity when he talks about the brothers. Coincidentally, Belarus is in the same category. Brothers are actually, little brothers to the big Russ in Russia. So historically, this is false. This is false preaching, if you will. Actually, Kiev, Ukraine, was a thriving city when Moscow was just a little village. And so the formation of Russia actually emanated from Ukraine. Russia went off and became something else, and then became the Soviet Union, and Ukraine went its own way, especially after the revolution of 2014. So what has happened since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 is the individual former Soviet Union states, the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, all the members of the Warsaw Pact, South Caucasus, and the Central Asian states have basically sought their own political way. For a good number of them, those attached to Central and Western Europe, they decided to become members of NATO. NATO has an open door policy. Any country that wants to join may do so, but there's a long and protracted process for accession. They have to do reforms, etc. Ukraine was a bit divided. The eastern half, defined by the Dnipro River, which actually cuts it in 1/3 to the right or the east and 2/3 to the west. The western part is leaning towards the EU and Europe. They see that as the way forward economically, culturally, and so forth. Prior to 2014, there was a very strong leaning of the Russian-speaking folks on the east side of the Dnieper River, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, and some of the provinces to the east, bordering Russia. In fact, they had Russian-speaking people. They were ethnically Russian. They had Russian culture, etc. But as 2014 unveiled itself, with Russia invading Crimea and also invading Donetsk and Luhansk and creating this so-called Donbas area, the people of Ukraine saw the effects of Russian invasion, and they didn't like it. It became repugnant to them. The suppression of the people, suppression of history, culture, everything that was Ukrainian was kicked out of these regions. Suppression of minorities, particularly in Crimea, the Tartars, as an example. And the destruction of the economies, particularly in Luhansk and Donetsk, had very strong industrial economies, and they were ruined. So there's been, since 2014, a shift towards, hey, Russia's no good for us, and we can't pin our hopes on them in the future. We love them. We speak Russian. We're tied to their culture by our heritage, but we're Ukrainian, and we want a Ukrainian identity. And they have a Ukrainian identity. It's rich. It's 2,300 years old. So that really brings us to where we are now, which is Putin's war aims. So let me enumerate what he wants specifically. First, he wants Crimea and the breakaway republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, collectively known as Donbas, to be recognized by Ukraine and the world as Russian territory and secure in the Russian Federation. Second thing is he wants Ukraine out of NATO and NATO out of Ukraine. Specifically, he wants a neutral state along the Finland, Sweden, Switzerland model, where they don't favor one side or the other, and they maintain strict neutrality, both politically and militarily. No alignment with NATO. Third, he wants a Russian-friendly government in Kiev. So when he invaded, he wanted to do a decapitation strike and take the government out. That didn't happen. So he wants somebody that's basically subservient to Russia's political priorities and their economic needs. Fourth, he wants to reset the security architecture of Europe. Specifically, he wants NATO pushed back to the pre-1998 borders. He wants all NATO troops out of the existing republics that are part of it. He didn't want US, German, UK, anybody in the Baltics, no non-native troops in the post-1998 NATO countries. And he wants to be able to restore Russian influence there. What he wants is he wants those countries to fear and be concerned with Russian military preeminence. And then finally, the other nations in the region, that's Belarus, Georgia, and Moldova, they need to be brought into the Russian fold as well. In the case of Belarus, they've already been subverted. Their elections were sham that they had a year and a half ago. It caused significant social unrest. Russia came in and helped them put down those demonstrations in the opposition and destroyed the opposition, and now effectively occupies the country with about 30,000 troops pre-conflict. Georgia, as we know, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are occupied by Russian troops, and that represents about 20% of the landmass of Georgia. Moldova has the Transnistria area with a large Russian formation in it, still called the Breakaway Republic of Transnistria, that's not recognized by anybody but Russia. So that's where he wants to go geostrategically, and that's where we are today.
Wonderful. Thank you, General. I want to touch on something that you discussed in these opening remarks, which is that heading into this 20th day of actual conflict, one of the assessments that we've heard many times is that Russia underestimated the capabilities and effectiveness of the Ukrainian army. As a major general with a wealth of on-the-ground experience in Ukraine, what is your assessment about that statement?
Thanks for that question, Michael. Yeah, so it hasn't gone particularly well for Russia to this point, but I'm going to caveat that towards the end. So Russia has committed somewhere between 60 and 75% of its ground forces to this campaign. The strategic forces, like its rocket forces and its air forces, is kept back in the Russian mainland, and they're being employed from afar. They have not been deployed into Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is active and engaged, and he's also brought over the Caspian Fleet through the Volga-Don River complex into the Sea of Azov and into the Black Sea, and essentially created a maritime blockade from the south and east or southeast. And of course, he's got forces flowing in from Belarus and Russia proper. So he's got a very robust capability in country. But it's not going as envisioned. First off, there's been no quick victory, which was his strategic expectation, if you will, that he would not be drawn into a protracted conflict. That's a significant challenge for him. Ukraine will not relent or surrender, in my estimation. And we can talk about that later. So he's run into logistical problems, and they've been compounded by the environment. And that's primarily associated with the main effort, which is coming in from the north and the northeast. Outside of Donbas, he's got an attack coming in from east to west. They've run into stiff resistance, and they're not progressing. So they've squeezed south towards Crimea. At the same time, the southern axis of attack is pushing up from Crimea through the southern province of Kherson, and then along the Sea of Azov to create a land corridor between Russia in the east and Crimea in the south of Ukraine. So that southern approach is having less problems than in the north. The north problem is twofold. One, poor infrastructure once they cross the border. Really didn't support the amount of forces that they were trying to squeeze through to Kiev and some of the other places. Additionally, the environment has really hurt them, specifically weather. It was too warm for the ground to freeze, and it is rather marshy up north. And so if they got off the road, it was slow going and muddy. In many cases, they got stuck, and the vehicles they were using did not have sufficient cross-country mobility. So the environment and the infrastructure really compounded their logistical problems. You throw on top of that fierce combat from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are fighting a defense in depth and retreating into the cities and fighting a war of attrition, essentially, in the front, while territorial army forces and irregulars are attacking them from the rear, and causing significant pain to Russian forces, particularly the non-combat service support guys that are mainly logistical types that are not very well suited for rear area combat. The Russian forces have managed to secure two bits of key terrain so far. One is the North Crimea Canal. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, the Ukrainians wisely cut off the source of water for Crimea, which is the North Crimea Canal. It flows from the Dnipro River, about 125 kilometers north of Crimea, down to Crimea and provides all the fresh water. So since 2014, Crimea has been reliant on groundwater, which is a ground corridor from mainland Russia to Crimea. That's not complete yet, but it's pretty close to complete. The next thing is he is just deliberately destroying these cities. We see this in the news every day of Kherson in the south, Mariupol in the east, which is almost completely devastated. The water, sewer, electricity, all government functions, everything are destroyed there. And most of the buildings are either destroyed or being destroyed. The idea is to run all the civilian population out of there. And anybody that is left is considered a combatant, either in uniform or in a regular, like a guerrilla or something like that. So that campaign is almost complete. Up north, he's also encircled the cities up there in Kiev and beyond, and in the process of maturing the forces in the region. Again, there are local counterattacks from various forces associated with Ukrainian armed forces. And they're having some success, but it is not decisive at the moment. What we have overall here on the 20th day, as you said, Michael, is we have a tactical pause for the Russians. They're tactically paused because they need to resupply, they need to reorganize, and they need to refit their forces. My estimation is they've suffered about 20 to 25% casualties on their equipment. Russian equipment is not particularly robust and has a tendency to break down. They've also suffered somewhere between 5 and 10% casualties. I think it might be higher, but those are reliable numbers, 5 to 10%. So he's got to reorganize their forces. And in fact, somewhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of the combat forces that came across the border on the first day have either been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective.
General Repass, we have been hearing for the past days the request of President Zelensky for a no-fly zone. How is the air superiority from the Russian Air Force a factor that could accelerate their goals, mainly towards Kyiv and toward other large cities? And how can the Ukrainians hold this back without the air capability?
Yeah, so this is you've thrown in 4 or 5 factors that we could discuss for hours. I think. Let me be brief on this. First, on Russian so-called air superiority, they do not have air superiority, in that they are interdicted by ground-based air defenses from the Ukrainian armed forces, both in the form of S-300 missiles and anti-aircraft missiles provided by the US and the UK that are destroying their air power, primarily helicopters and fighter bomber aircraft. What they don't have is they don't have the broad coverage that they would need to have air superiority across the country. What they do is they have local air superiority in places where they operate, mainly bombing the concentrated urban centers of Kiev, the outskirts of Kiev. Mariupol is just about destroyed, and up north as well. So if they venture beyond that, they have pretty good probability of having free reign of where they go, because the air defenses are really concentrated around Kiev and some other key cities. But when they go out west, they're somewhat free out there. Could be interdicted, but not likely. But what they've chosen to do is use long-range strike assets, where they actually cast their cruise missiles caliber or other type of cruise missiles from inside Russian terrain where they won't be shot down inside Russia proper. So they have proven that they have no experience in planning or conducting large-scale air offensive operations, something that NATO and particularly the U.S. would be capable of doing. They just don't seem to be capable of marshaling that type of capability. On the air defense side, as I said, they're concentrated mainly around Kiev and the larger cities, and everything else is left to the wolves, unfortunately. I have to say that. There's no other way around it. In regards to a no-fly zone, there are many permutations to this discussion. I'm going to give you the general explanation and then one example of what may be feasible in the future. The no-fly zone concept is that there's an area of operations where no aircraft are allowed to operate for any reason whatsoever. That is enforced by fighter aircraft from an outside force, either NATO or a coalition of the willing. For those aircraft to effectively operate there and operate there with impunity and to be able to enforce that no-fly zone, they have to destroy or mitigate all the things that may shoot them down. In this case, the radars that are controlling the airspace over Ukraine are inside of Russia. Many of their advanced capabilities, like the S-400, are capable of ranging south of Kiev. So not only can Russian air defenses detect anything trying to fly over Kiev, but they can also interdict it with the S-400 capability from inside sanctuary inside Russia. So either local tactical capabilities like the Pantsir or the SA-7 Grail or something like that the tactical forces have in Ukraine, or the Russian higher echelon theater air defense capabilities like the S-400, S-300s and the radars in sanctuary in Ukraine. All of that would have to be shut down. So the probability of that happening is extremely low. What is possible, and in my view, absolutely necessary, is the establishment of a humanitarian no-fly zone and a humanitarian corridor safe zones, similar to what we did in Bosnia. They had limited viability over the long term, and eventually the Serbs or Croatians overran most of them, but they did allow the people to live in relative peace for a number of years. So I think for humanitarian purposes, we should force Russia to ask or defend their position of why they would not support a humanitarian safe zone or safe corridor, and that a third party is willing to enforce said safe zone and safe corridors. I would force Russia to defend that notion on a humanitarian basis, if it were me.
Thank you, General.
Thank you.
That is, I think that the reasons that you just put forth make it clear how escalatory a no-fly zone would become and how quickly that would happen. I want to touch on something that you spoke about a few minutes ago, which is the current moment, right? Usually about 3 weeks in is when troops need to resupply. There is a stalling to resupply and reorganize. Russian forces appear to have stalled, especially when met with the surprising, to some at least, the effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces. So my question is, what do we expect now? What is the next chapter of the conflict? We've seen this morning in Kyiv some pretty indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. And how does that affect this next chapter of the conflict?
Yeah, let me kind of give you what I think is next, what the next steps are, and what some possible outcomes are, or outlines of what that might look like. First off, let me talk about Russia in Ukraine. They must prevail in Ukraine, or all is lost at home. Putin has no off-ramp here. So he has a maximalist strategy, in that it is victory or nothing. Come home with your shield or on it, as they say. So he has a maximalist strategy. He didn't expect this, but But in America, we have this saying, you have clever sayings in Brazil, but we have one here as well. And that is, when the vicious neighborhood dog chases the car, the question always becomes, what happens when he catches the car? So in this case, Putin has caught the car. Okay, he chased it, and now he's caught it, and he doesn't know what to do with it because the car turned out to be overwhelmingly something he did not expect. So that's where he is now. He does not have an off-ramp that allows him to extract out of this with dignity and with the previous posture, his stature in the international community that he had. So breaking this down a little bit from that strategic statement, when we talk about Russia and Ukraine, first, they'll continue to negotiate in bad faith. That's really to stall so that he can resupply and rearm. Second, he'll destroy major cities to create humanitarian disasters en route to his military goals. So again, he wants all civilians out so that he can destroy the military in a war of attrition around these cities. And he wants those occupants, anybody that's a potential insurgent, after things calm down, he wants them out of the region. I saw a letter today from the Minister of Defense to Putin that he wants to cut down all the trees in the areas that are occupied by Russians at the moment to eliminate any potential opportunity for hiding. Next, he wants to make continued resistance appear futile and too bloody for Ukraine to endure. So he's going to inflict maximum pain on Ukraine. Indiscriminate bombing, destroy hospitals, schools, old people homes, dwellings, apartment buildings, large apartment buildings, and it's all to break the will of the people. So it's total war on his side, and it turns out total war on the Ukrainian side as well. Next, where we find this is Russia at home. So Russia at home is in an unexpected place as well. The sanctions are going to bite the economy sooner rather than later. They've already got rationing of some food items, and he's banned the export of commodities. So things cannot leave Russia because they may be needed domestically. The exception to that, of course, is energy, which is still a money-making venture for Russia. Domestic opposition is growing, but it's still too few in number to have any significant political effect. And quite frankly, Putin doesn't care. He just doesn't care what the people think. He thinks that if he achieves his strategic end of acquiring Ukraine and increasing the geography of Russia, that he'll have a strategic success that in 100 years, nobody will remember how painful it was. And then he has cut down, or he has eliminated all reporting from the outside. He's isolated Russian media. And the only thing that the people hear is what the state media is feeding them. BBC has continued or restarted shortwave radio broadcast into Russia. And there are some internet avenues into Russia as well. But by and large, the Russian people believe that this is a limited denazification operation and limited to the Donetsk area. They don't understand, they have no idea that Ukrainian cities are being destroyed and the civilians killed in the process. And where's Russia internationally? Well, this is somewhat obvious to your audience. The first one, it's isolated. It's isolated from the international community, and it really doesn't have any friends with the exception of China and the traditional pariah states. Second, it's lost, the world has lost its fear of the Russian military, conventional military. That veil has been pierced. The Russian war machine, the Russian invincibility, all this stuff that we've seen since the Cold War, that has been smashed by the Ukrainian defenses. A numerically inferior but a highly trained force has essentially taken on and done very well against the vaunted Russian ground forces. What we see is Russia exiting the world stage as a key influencer, both politically and economically. And we're seeing it happen before our eyes. My prediction is that Putin cannot recover from this debacle in any way, shape, or form. So his days are numbered, and his fate is directly tied to what happens in Ukraine. Somebody inside will decide to do something with him, or he himself will hopefully decide to move on for whatever's best of Russia.
General Repass, you mentioned China as one of the few friends that Russia has. Yeah. Over the past days, there are rumors and stories about the Russian government asking China for some sort of military support. First, is this a sign of desperation? And second, since the nature of the Chinese government, though they're very similar with Russia in many aspects, but they have a more economic concern of their role and their place in the world. First, is it a sign of desperation from Putin? And second, do you see China actually engaging in this sort of support for the Russians?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as desperation, but it's certainly an alarming development for Russia watchers to see Putin going to China. What we know publicly is he asked for minor stuff, you know, and the rumor was he asked for military aid. That, if it's true, is surprising, but he knows that he's getting ground up seriously and significantly in Ukraine. So the question is, what happens to China? That's a great question. I've read a fair amount of that on the last for the past few days here. China has tried to play both sides of the coin. They're walking a very fine line right now, and are in danger of tipping to one side or the other. I think they're waiting to see how far Russia is going to fall, and then they'll realize that Russia is by far on the sinking ship, and they should not cast their lots with that organization. They'll be forever pariahs. But the United States and others that have done this global sanctioning of China, of Russia, have made it clear to people explicitly. And the explicit statement is this: if you support Russia in any way, shape, or form and help them break the sanctions, then we will sanction you accordingly. This has been an explicit warning. There's no nuance to it whatsoever. Coming out of the U.S. State Department, embassies across the world have gone to their host nation leadership and made it very clear that you will be sanctioned if you approach Russia and support them in any way. To date, you've got limited support out of Georgia. You've got limited support out of China in that they didn't support the UN movements, and you got some unusual characters at the UN that helped, I would say, block a unanimous vote against Russia or condemnation of Russia. So where does this leave China? China, in this case, is going to have to choose. They're going to have to choose based on economic necessity. It is my view that a nation will do what it's in its strategic interests 100% of the time. And it is in China's strategic interest to not side with Russia and to side with the rest of the world that are imposing these sanctions.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, General. I want to touch back on the U.S. position because you have extensive experience working with the U.S. and NATO, who have had important roles in Ukraine, roles involving training and advisory support, especially after 2014. So when we look at the U.S. government's positioning during this conflict, going back to the very beginning with the widespread sharing of intelligence reports that anticipated many of the moves that we saw from Putin, and also seemed to prove very effective in generating a global unity regarding some of the moves that have been made in these last few weeks and last couple months. it's been made very clear that the US government has no interest in having American boots on the ground in Ukraine. Where is the line where that could change? Is there, I mean, I know NATO has a position where, you know, a direct attack of any NATO territory would lead to direct NATO involvement. We came very close a couple of days ago with attacks on the border in Poland. So how do you see US involvement and NATO involvement moving forward? What are the scenarios where they could be brought in and we could see true escalation of this conflict?
Yeah, so you're really talking about horizontal escalation in response to what would be vertical escalation. So vertical escalation would come on Russia's side, where they increase the level of violence and create a greater humanitarian disaster. As we know, somewhere in the range of 2.5 million refugees have already been created across Ukraine's borders into Europe. There's also about 1.5 million internally displaced persons. So on the main, you've got a very large humanitarian movement going on, but it will get much worse with this destruction of the cities. Potentially, the UN estimated there could be up to 5 million refugees in Europe within a year if this continues, if this drags out. I think the number could go up to as high as 8 million, quite frankly, when you count in the major metropolitan centers and the fact that there will be no government services or public infrastructure available. It could be substantially higher of Ukraine's 41 million people pre-war. So what I see as a possibility is creating mass casualties or mass human suffering over a period of time through the destruction of the cities and the public infrastructure, destruction of the water, the power, the sewers. There's a lot of reporting in open press about Russia staging a false flag operation. They've tried a couple of times already, not very well, by the way, but they've tried to establish or create these false flag operations to fit its narrative back home of Ukraine had nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, and now we're going to have to take care of the weapons of mass destruction. So potentially Russia could use a chemical weapon or a chemical compound that's organic to Ukraine. They're Europe's largest producer of ammonia, which could be highly caustic and hurt a lot of populations. They've already contaminated multiple water supplies with available ammonia in country. But they could use a chemical to create a mass casualty situation in a country, similar to what they did in Syria, to get rid of the civilians out of the cities or out of an area where they want to control. That's the first possibility. The second possibility is they could use a advanced weapon like a hypersonic missile or something like that. I'm not talking about a nuclear missile or a nuclear weapon. I don't see that as in the range of possibility, but it's possible, but it's extremely remote. I don't think that would happen. So this increase in violence is a vertical increase in where we're at. The horizontal increase is where you expand the scope of what's happening. And that's where the other countries come in. I predict, as a matter of fact, that this humanitarian disaster that's pending will increasingly become the news more than the actual fight in country. So humanitarian suffering will take precedence over the war story coming out of the combat zone. There'll be an international outcry to do something, whatever something is, and that will increase pressure on the UN, NATO, or a coalition of the willing, as we've had in many other places, to do something. I've already described what something might be. Something might be a humanitarian corridor, humanitarian safe zone, something to put Russia on notice that a coalition of the willing, the UN or NATO are willing to intervene to stop the human suffering that's being created by Russia. So I think that it's going to take something along those lines, a tremendous disaster, either in a slow boil that we see right now, or something, just catastrophic created by a single incident that would require outside intervention to say the violence has exceeded anything that we're willing to accept. Politically, we're quite far behind where we need to be on the policy and political acceptance of the risks that we would incur by doing something along humanitarian lines. We're quite farther behind on anything that might necessitate putting US, NATO, or other boots on the ground, coalition of the willing boots on the ground. We're a long way from there politically. However, I would say the conditions are being set for that. There was a poll in the United States here recently, over the weekend, and it looks like across the political spectrum, somewhat higher on the Democrat side, about 80% of Democrats support doing a humanitarian no-fly zone, where it's about 75% on independents and Republicans. So domestic political support is there. Internationally, I don't know where we're at. I think the Europeans will come along sooner than the Americans will on doing something directly in Ukraine. I believe it's a matter of time, not if, it's a matter of when, but it's going to take a humanitarian disaster to happen first.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, General. I'm going to ask a very, very complicated question, which is, what is your expectation of timing in relation to the duration of the war and the potential scenarios that can emerge from, for example, timing for Putin to have complete control of Ukraine, or timing for him to for a stalemate or a ceasefire? How do you see in terms of chronology of what we're having right now?
Man, if I knew the answer to that accurately, I would be perhaps a wealthy man. But okay, so timing. Let's talk possible outlines or outcomes that might happen here. I don't think that there's some timings that we can talk about. I'll just embed that in my comments here. First off, the World Economic Order, one outcome that is absolutely underway right now that your audience needs to be aware of. The World Economic Order is being significantly altered in real time due to sanctions. I'll give you two examples. I was just in the South Caucasus, and I had several conversations in both countries, Azerbaijan and Georgia. In the case of Azerbaijan, 100% of their agriculture is exported to Russia. But that agricultural export only represents 10 to 15% of the energy-based economy. So energy is the rest of the GDP there. So you say, okay, 10 or 15% off of GDP, that's pretty significant, but it's not earth-shattering. Well, it's earth-shattering if you're the 40% of the population that produce the agriculture that's exported. So while it has low economic impact, it has high social impact. See, so that's happening. That variations of that theme are happening all along the frontline countries of Russia, Central Asian states, South Caucasus, over into Central and Western Europe. Anybody that does direct trade with Russia is being affected. And it's all the frontline states that are being affected in ways that are substantial, both economically and socially. In the case of Azerbaijan, again, they get most of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. That wheat's not going to be there at some point in time, maybe in the next year. In the case of Georgia, somewhere around 80% of their wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. If you've ever been to Georgia, you know how important bread is to their culture and their diet. So that will have a significant effect on the economy and also socially in the country. So those themes are being repeated across the front there. energy markets are being stressed. The European demand for energy cannot be met by energy coming out of the Central Asian states through the South Caucasus, in the Caspian Sea, into Eastern Europe and into Central Europe. Coming out of Libya, they can't meet the demand as well. At max capacity, you can get somewhere around 10 billion cubic meters of gas from the South Caucasus, 10 additional billion cubic meters per year to Europe. That would make up maybe 10 or 15% of their total energy shortfall. You got to have something else to go on top of that. There's some energy there's some innovative routes that are going through Iran on a negotiated basis that is not in violation of sanctions. That's being worked and potentially will come on board. And then finally, not finally, but you have energy coming out of Israel, in the area between Israel and Cyprus, the oil fields, the energy fields there. But that's somewhat low volume at this point in time, going up into Ceylon and into Turkey. The next is anything coming out of Algeria, Northern Africa, basically, into the Libyan pipelines and up into Italy. That needs to be drastically increased. But again, we got Russia making trouble down there in Libya, and you got some instability. So there's oil instability in Libya, as well as anything transiting Ukraine. So in the immediate this year, you're going to have some energy disruptions in Europe, which affects both pricing and output.
Thank you, General.
Yeah.
As we were discussing previously, I think every single one of these questions we could discuss for hours. So I'd like to already extend an invitation to a future conversation as we start winding down our time here. But I have a couple more questions that I think are very interesting. Your discussion about the economic consequences of sanctions is something that we discussed last Sunday in a conversation with clients. And not only that, but the very likely economic collapse, not only of the banking system, but of the productive sector of a G20 economy in such a short period of time is something that we really haven't seen, and something that will stress the economic fabric, I think, of our global economic system. The issue of reducing dependence on Russian exports is interesting also because of the parallels it creates with China, right? Because we have so many countries that, especially even the private sector, we're seeing companies draw out of Russia, but the conversation for China is something else altogether. So my question is how do you see this driving conversations on U.S. economic policy regarding China, which has been changing over the last, I would say, 10 years pretty significantly? And then a second question is, what are the elements of this conflict that the media is missing? As somebody who has a wealth of experience on the ground, what do people who are watching this and who want to have accurate information about this conflict, what is missing from traditional coverage of this conflict? Okay, great. So China, then missing coverage. First on China, as I mentioned before, China is going to have to decide who they're going to support. But with the exit of Russia from the international economy, as you mentioned, a G20 country, they're going to create that absence is going to create opportunities to fill that vacuum that they've created. New or potentially underexploited assets and opportunities will now become more viable on the international market, I think. In the case of China, China is watching this thing with eyes wide open, quite frankly, because they know, given their aims for Taiwan, if they were to go after Taiwan, the world's going to unplug from China as well, no matter how painful that can be. So China
can hedge its bets best by sidling up with the world that has opposed Russia. It will avoid that sanction regime. And there are some critical things that'll come. So, all right, my iPhone is going to be made in Brazil next year. If we sanction China, I'm not losing anything by that. But I will tell you that with all these sanctions and Russia dropping out, there are opportunities for companies in across the planet to make up for what Russia is vacating. And China will be a big part of that, in that they will try to exploit those departures for its own good, in my opinion. They're very good at doing that. They have pretty much a stranglehold on the rare earths and a lot of the natural resources coming out of Africa and so forth. So China is being very wary, and they have to watch with some amazement, I think, is what's going on here. So what's being underreported? The first thing that's being underreported is what's the slow collapse of the Russian economy, because we really don't have good eyes and ears in there. I predict that the Russian economy will collapse in another 2 or 3 months. This is the one timeline that I was going to predict out here that you asked me about earlier. But I think in 2 or 3 months, the Russian economy will collapse, and that will beget its own humanitarian disaster inside Russia. So when I talk about humanitarian means and humanitarian actions, Putin in 2 or 3 months will have a very big incentive to agree to humanitarian actions inside Ukraine, because he's going to have his own humanitarian disaster out there. So that's the first story that's being underreported. The second story that's being underreported is what's happening to the second and third order effects of sanctions. I've already talked about Georgia and Azerbaijan. But all along the border countries of Russia, what's not being reported is these countries are scrambling to mitigate the damage that's being done to their economies as a result of the sanctions. There are opportunities for exporters to get in there and to make up for what they will no longer get for Russia. So there's the first opportunity in that. The second opportunity is whatever those borderline countries are exporting will need markets other than Russia. So perhaps there's a bargain to be had there. So I think from a business perspective, there are both opportunities and hazards out there that are being underreported associated with the sanctions. And then finally, I think everybody recognizes, but nobody's really taking a hard look at the fact that NATO in particular, but North America with NATO and the European partners and the EU have all drawn closer together. We've also drawn in other countries that are somewhat far afield: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea into a very large coalition that is shutting off the Russian money. I see opportunities for Central and South America in there as well. Let me turn it over to you for closing out.
Thank you so much, Major General. It's been a true honor to have this conversation with you. I know that these insights are rare, and the depth of conversation is somewhat rare in this current scenario, where a lot of the analysis is very immediate on what's happened in the last few hours. So this in-depth, broader picture, I'm sure, has just a lot of value for everybody who's watching, for our clients, and for everybody at Arko. I'd like to thank you again for your availability, for your honesty and transparency in these discussions. I'd like to again reiterate that we would love to have you back to discuss this issue, which, as you say, is unlikely to disappear from our agenda anytime soon. So I'd like to formally request that you return to speak with us. And if there's anything, any closing statements that you'd like to make, please feel free. Otherwise, it's been a true pleasure having this conversation.
Yeah, so I accept the offer to come back, first and foremost. Second, I would ask you and your audience to judge me by my predictions here. I try to be accurate. I've done fairly well on this one in the case of Russia invading Ukraine. I've had some misses, but you guys can judge me and perhaps give me a scorecard next time around.
We'll hold you to that.
Okay, let's do that. And then I would say in closing, though, that Ukraine is under intense pressure and the people are suffering. This is an extremely sad moment, not only for Ukraine, but for the world as we watch this unfold before our eyes. Russia has created a heinous violation of human rights and the international order here, and they need to be held accountable.
Thank you so much, Major General. And thank you to everybody from Arko Advice and our clients for tuning in. We'll continue the discussion as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, General Repass.
Thank you.